Sarah walked into the crowded office break room, her heart pounding as conversation suddenly stopped. She could feel 30 pairs of eyes following her every movement as she made her way to the coffee machine. The whispers had been going on for weeks now, ever since she started missing important meetings and arriving late to work. "There she goes again," Marcus whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Probably has another mysterious doctor's appointment." His voice dripped with sarcasm, and several colleagues chuckled in response. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee. She had been working at Peterson Marketing for 3 years, and until recently, she had been one of their most reliable employees. Her creative campaigns had won the company several awards, and her dedication was unquestionable. But lately, everything had changed. "Sarah, we need to talk," came the stern voice of Mr. Peterson, the company owner, from behind her. The room fell completely silent now, with everyone pretending to be busy while clearly listening to every word. She turned around to face him, her coffee cup shaking in her hands. Mr. Peterson was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. He had always been fair with his employees, but Sarah could see the disappointment written across his face. "My office. 5 minutes," he said curtly before walking away. The moment he left, the room erupted in hushed conversations. Sarah heard fragments of what people were saying about her. Some thought she was lying about being sick. Others believed she had found another job and was just collecting paychecks while interviewing elsewhere. Marcus, who had always been competitive with her, seemed to take particular pleasure in her downfall. "I told you guys she was unreliable," Marcus said, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "All that success went to her head. Now she thinks she can just show up whenever she wants." Jennifer, a newer employee who had looked up to Sarah, shook her head in disappointment. "I really thought she was different. I guess you never really know someone." Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying. These people had been her friends, her work family. They had celebrated her achievements and supported her through difficult projects. Now they were all turning against her, and she could not even blame them. From the outside, her behavior must have looked inexcusable. She walked slowly toward Mr. Peterson's office, her mind racing with thoughts of how to explain herself. But how could she tell them the truth when she was not even ready to accept it herself? How could she reveal the real reason behind her absences when it would change everything about how people saw her? The hallway to Mr. Peterson's office felt longer than usual. Sarah passed by the conference room where she had presented her award-winning campaign just 6 months ago. She remembered how proud she had felt that day, how secure her future at the company had seemed. Now she was walking toward what might be the end of her career. She knocked on the door and heard Mr. Peterson's voice telling her to come in. His office was spacious, with large windows overlooking the city and walls covered with framed awards and photos from company events. Sarah had been in this office many times before, usually for praise or promotions. Today felt very different. "Please sit down, Sarah," Mr. Peterson said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His tone was professional but cold, nothing like the warm conversations they used to have. Sarah sat down, placing her coffee cup on the small table beside her chair. She noticed her hands were still shaking and quickly folded them in her lap to hide her nervousness. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you," Mr. Peterson began, leaning forward in his chair. "Your performance over the past 2 months has been completely unacceptable. You've missed 4 important client meetings, been late to work 15 times, and yesterday you left in the middle of the Johnson presentation without any explanation." Each word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She knew he was right about everything, but hearing it laid out so clearly made her realize how bad things had really gotten. "I know this doesn't sound like the Sarah I hired 3 years ago," Mr. Peterson continued, The Sarah who stayed late to perfect every detail, who never missed a deadline, who brought in our biggest clients. So I have to ask you directly, what's going on? Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain that some mornings she woke up in such severe pain that getting dressed took an hour? How could she tell him about the medical appointments, the tests, the procedures that left her exhausted and emotionally drained? How could she describe the fear that consumed her every day, the uncertainty about her future, the way her body was betraying her in ways she never imagined possible? She started, then stopped. The truth was too complicated, too personal, too frightening to share. I've been having some personal issues, she finally managed to say, the words sounding weak and inadequate even to her own ears. Mr. Peterson's expression hardened. Personal issues? Sarah, everyone has personal issues. That's not an excuse for the kind of behavior you've been displaying. Do you think Marcus doesn't have personal problems? Do you think Jennifer or any of our other employees don't face challenges in their personal lives? Sarah felt her cheeks burning with shame. She knew how her excuse sounded. Vague, unconvincing, and disrespectful to her colleagues who managed to maintain their professionalism despite their own struggles. You're one of our most talented employees, Mr. Peterson said, his voice softening slightly. That's why I'm giving you this chance to explain. But I need the truth, Sarah, not vague excuses about personal issues. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken expectations. Sarah could hear the clock ticking on the wall, marking each second of her hesitation. She thought about her medical files at home, thick with test results and specialist reports. She thought about the scars hidden beneath her carefully chosen clothing, the evidence of a battle she was fighting alone. I understand if you can't share details, Mr. Peterson said finally. But I need to know that you're committed to this job, and that whatever is going on will be resolved soon. Because, Sarah, I can't continue to make excuses for you with our clients and other employees. Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. I understand, Mr. Peterson. I'm committed to this job. It means everything to me. Then prove it, he said firmly. Starting tomorrow, I need to see the old Sarah. No more tardiness, no more missed meetings, no more mysterious disappearances. Can you promise me that? The question hung in the air like a challenge she was not sure she could meet. How could she promise something when she had no control over when her body would cooperate? How could she guarantee her attendance when her next surgery was scheduled for the following month? I'll do my best, she said quietly. Your best hasn't been good enough lately, Mr. Peterson replied bluntly. I need a commitment, not another vague promise. Sarah felt trapped between her desire to keep her job and her inability to control her circumstances. She thought about her medical bills, her insurance that barely covered her treatments, and how much she needed this job not just financially, but emotionally. This work had been her anchor, her source of pride and identity. Losing it would mean losing a part of herself. Yes, sir, she said finally. I promise. But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah knew she was making a promise she might not be able to keep. And judging by the skeptical look in Mr. Peterson's eyes, he knew it too. After leaving his office, Sarah returned to her desk to find Marcus smirking at her. Rough meeting? He asked with fake concern. Don't worry, I'm sure your personal issues will sort themselves out eventually. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt something inside her snap. For weeks she had endured his comments, his pointed looks, his obvious pleasure in her struggles. She was tired of being the object of office gossip, tired of being judged by people who had no idea what she was going through. But instead of confronting him, Sarah simply gathered her things and left for the day. She had learned that sometimes the strongest response was silence, even when every fiber of her being wanted to fight back. As she walked to her car, Sarah caught her reflection in the office building's glass doors. She looked tired, older than her 28 years, and defeated. The confident, successful woman who had walked through those same doors 3 years ago seemed like a stranger now. Driving home through the busy city streets, Sarah thought about her conversation with Mr. Peterson and the impossible promise she had made. She thought about Marcus and his cruel comments, about Jennifer's disappointed expression, about all the colleagues who had once respected her and now whispered behind her back. Most of all, she thought about the truth she was hiding and wondered how much longer she could keep it to herself. The weight of her secret was becoming unbearable, but the fear of judgment was even worse. She had seen how people treated those they perceived as weak or damaged. She had witnessed the subtle discrimination, the pity disguised as concern, the way opportunities dried up once people knew about your limitations. But as she pulled into her apartment complex, Sarah realized that keeping her secret was destroying her life just as surely as revealing it might. She was losing her job, her reputation, and her relationships because she was too afraid to tell the truth about what she was really facing. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, surrounded by medical reports and prescription bottles, trying to figure out how to save her career without sacrificing her privacy. She had always been a problem solver, someone who could find creative solutions to complex challenges. But this problem seemed impossible to solve. She picked up one of her medical reports and stared at the diagnosis that had changed everything. The words were clear and clinical, but they could not capture the fear, pain, and uncertainty that came with them. They could not explain the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, or the way her body had become a source of betrayal rather than strength. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine walking into work tomorrow as if nothing had happened, as if she could simply will herself back to her old productivity and reliability. But she knew that was impossible. Her condition was not going away, and pretending otherwise was only making everything worse. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between continuing to hide her truth and losing everything she had worked for, or finding the courage to reveal her secret and face whatever consequences came with that revelation. The choice seemed obvious, but Sarah knew that sometimes the right decision was also the scariest one to make, and as she drifted off to sleep, she wondered if her colleagues would ever be able to see past their assumptions and understand the real story behind her recent behavior. The next morning arrived too quickly for Sarah. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts about the conversation she knew she had to have. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, she carefully applied makeup to cover the dark circles under her eyes and the pallor that had become her constant companion over the past months. Her reflection showed a woman who looked put together on the surface, but Sarah could see the exhaustion and stress that no amount of concealer could hide. She had become an expert at creating facades, at looking normal when everything inside her felt broken. As she got dressed, Sarah was especially careful about her clothing choices. She selected a high-necked blouse that would cover the surgical scars on her collarbone and upper chest, and a blazer that would hide the port that had been surgically placed in her arm for her treatments. Every morning required this careful choreography of concealment, and she had become so good at it that even she sometimes forgot what she was hiding. The drive to work felt different today. Instead of the usual dread that had been accompanying her commute lately, Sarah felt a strange sense of determination. She had spent most of the night thinking about Mr. Peterson's ultimatum and Marcus's cruel comments, and she had finally reached a breaking point. She arrived at the office 15 minutes early, hoping to have a few moments to collect herself before facing her colleagues. But as she walked through the lobby, she could already hear familiar voices coming from the break room. "I bet she doesn't even show up today," Marcus was saying with his characteristic smugness. "Probably has another mysterious emergency that only she seems to have." Maybe we should start a betting pool on her excuses, another voice chimed in, followed by laughter that made Sarah's stomach churn. Sarah paused outside the break room, listening to her colleagues tear apart what remained of her reputation. She heard Jennifer's voice joining in, expressing disappointment about how Sarah had let the team down. She heard Tom from accounting wondering aloud if Sarah was having a nervous breakdown. She heard Lisa from Human Resources speculating about substance abuse problems. Each comment felt like a dagger, but instead of retreating as she had been doing for weeks, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months: anger. Pure, righteous anger at the assumptions they were making, at their complete lack of compassion, at their willingness to destroy her character rather than consider that there might be more to the story. She walked into the break room with her head held high, and the conversation immediately stopped. The silence was deafening, and Sarah could feel the discomfort radiating from her colleagues as they realized she had heard at least some of their discussion. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah said calmly, moving toward the coffee machine with steady steps. Marcus, never one to back down from confrontation, cleared his throat. "Well, well, look who decided to grace us with her presence, and early too. Should we alert the media?" A few nervous chuckles followed his comment, but Sarah noticed that some of her colleagues looked uncomfortable with his obvious cruelty. Jennifer stared down at her coffee cup, suddenly very interested in stirring it. "Actually, Marcus," Sarah said, turning to face him with a composure that surprised even herself. "I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about my recent attendance issues." The room fell completely silent. This was not the response anyone had expected from Sarah, who had been avoiding confrontation for weeks. Marcus raised his eyebrows, clearly enjoying what he thought would be another opportunity to embarrass her. "Oh, this should be good. Let me guess. More personal issues that are somehow more important than the rest of ours?" Sarah felt her hands begin to shake again. But this time it was not from fear or shame. It was from the adrenaline that comes with finally deciding to fight back. "You're absolutely right, Marcus," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My issues are different from yours. And you know what? I'm tired of pretending they're not." She walked closer to where he was standing, and Sarah could see confusion starting to replace the smugness in his expression. This was not going according to his script. "For the past 3 months," Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the now completely silent break room, "I've been dealing with something that I hoped I could handle privately. I've been trying to maintain my professionalism and my privacy while managing a situation that has turned my entire world upside down." Jennifer looked up from her coffee cup, her expression shifting from disappointment to curiosity. Tom stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Lisa put down her phone. Everyone in the room was now focused entirely on Sarah. "But clearly," Sarah said, looking directly at Marcus, "my attempts to handle this quietly have been interpreted as carelessness, laziness, and disrespect. So let me clear up any confusion about what's really been going on." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "3 months ago," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Sarah watched as the expressions on her colleagues' faces changed from curiosity to shock to horror. Marcus's mouth fell open, and the color drained from his face. "The mysterious doctor appointments you've all been joking about?" Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength from finally speaking her truth. "Those were oncology consultations, surgical consultations, and chemotherapy sessions. The days I've been late to work, those were the days I could barely get out of bed because of the side effects from my treatments." Jennifer gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Tom's newspaper slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor with a soft rustling sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. "The mysterious emergency that made me leave the Johnson presentation," Sarah went on, looking around the room at faces that now reflected shame instead of judgment. "That was when I received a call from my oncologist about some concerning test results that required immediate attention." Marcus had gone completely pale, and Sarah could see him struggling to process what she was telling them. The man who had been so quick with sarcastic comments just moments before now seemed unable to find any words at all. "So you're absolutely right, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice now filled with a strength that came from finally telling her truth. "My personal issues are different from yours. Because while you've been worried about office politics and performance reviews, I've been worried about whether I'm going to live to see my 30th birthday." The silence in the room was now complete and profound. Sarah could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of traffic from the street below, but none of her colleagues made a sound. She reached up to her collar and, with hands that were now steady with resolve, began to unbutton her high-necked blouse. Her colleagues watched in stunned silence as she revealed the surgical scars that ran across her collarbone, the marks that told the story of her battle in ways that words never could. "These are the real reasons for my absences," Sarah said quietly, her fingers tracing the pale lines that marked where surgeons had inserted ports for her chemotherapy treatments. "These are what I've been hiding because I was terrified that people would treat me differently if they knew." Jennifer began to cry softly, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the evidence of Sarah's struggle. Tom looked like he might be sick, and Lisa had both hands pressed to her mouth in shock. But it was Marcus's reaction that surprised Sarah the most. The man who had been her biggest tormentor, who had taken such pleasure in her perceived failures, was now staring at her scars with an expression of complete devastation. His eyes filled with tears, and Sarah could see him struggling with the magnitude of his own cruelty. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Sarah rebuttoned her blouse slowly, giving her colleagues time to process what they had just learned. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, revealed a truth that would change everything about her relationships with these people. But instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, she felt liberated. "I never asked for your pity," Sarah said firmly, looking around the room at her colleagues. "I just wanted to do my job and maintain some sense of normalcy while dealing with the biggest challenge of my life. But I see now that keeping this secret was hurting not just me, but all of you, because it allowed you to create a story about who I am that wasn't true." She walked toward the door of the break room, then turned back to face the group one more time. "I have another chemotherapy session this afternoon," she said calmly, "so I'll be leaving work early today. But unlike all the other times, now you know why." As Sarah left the break room, she could hear the stunned silence beginning to break apart into whispered conversations and what sounded like Jennifer sobbing openly. She walked to her desk feeling lighter than she had in months, despite knowing that everything was about to change. Within an hour, word of Sarah's revelation had spread throughout the office. People who had been whispering about her unreliability were now whispering about her courage. Colleagues who had been avoiding her out of frustration were now approaching her desk to offer support and apologies. Mr. Peterson called her into his office again, but this time his demeanor was completely different. He apologized profusely for not recognizing what she was going through and immediately offered her flexible scheduling and any accommodations she needed to continue her treatment while maintaining her job. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked gently. "We could have worked something out. We could have supported you through this." Sarah explained her fears about discrimination and her desire to maintain her professional identity separate from her medical situation. She told him about the shame and stigma she had felt, about her worry that people would see her as weak or unreliable if they knew about her diagnosis. "Sarah," Mr. Peterson said with genuine emotion in his voice, "you're one of the strongest people I know. What you've been going through while still trying to do your job, I can't imagine the courage that took." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself having similar conversations with colleagues throughout the office. People shared their own experiences with illness, their family members' battles with cancer, their regrets about judging her so harshly. The office dynamic had shifted completely, from judgment and gossip to support and understanding. But it was her final conversation of the day that meant the most to her. As she was preparing to leave for her chemotherapy appointment, Marcus approached her desk. He looked like he had been crying, and his usual confidence was completely absent. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need to apologize to you, and I know that anything I say is going to sound inadequate after the way I've treated you." Sarah looked up at him, seeing vulnerability in his expression that she had never witnessed before. "I was cruel to you," he continued, his voice shaking. "I was jealous of your success, and when I saw what I thought was weakness, I attacked it. I said terrible things and encouraged others to doubt you when you were fighting for your life. I don't know how to make that right." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and shame in his eyes. She thought about all the hurtful comments, all the times he had made her feel small and inadequate, all the additional stress he had added to an already overwhelming situation. "Marcus," she said finally, "I appreciate your apology. But I need you to understand something. Your words hurt me when I was at my most vulnerable. They made me feel isolated and ashamed when I needed support the most." "That's not something that can be fixed with just an apology." He nodded, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. I know I can't undo what I did, but please tell me how I can try to make it better. Please tell me how I can support you going forward." Sarah considered his request carefully. Part of her wanted to reject his offer and let him live with the consequences of his actions. But another part of her recognized that his remorse was genuine and that holding on to anger would only hurt her more. "Start by treating people with kindness instead of looking for ways to tear them down," she said simply. "You never know what someone else is going through." As Sarah left the office that day to go to her chemotherapy appointment, she reflected on how dramatically everything had changed in just a few hours. By finally revealing her truth, she had transformed her work environment from a place of judgment and isolation into one of support and understanding. The revelation had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could focus on her healing instead of constantly managing other people's perceptions of her. She had learned that sometimes the thing you're most afraid to reveal is the very thing that can set you free. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same break room where she had made her life-changing revelation. But everything felt different now. The space that had once been filled with whispered judgments and cruel speculation was now warm with genuine conversation and laughter. Her colleagues no longer watched her with suspicion when she walked in late or left early for medical appointments. Instead, they checked in on her with real concern and offered practical support when she needed it. The chemotherapy had been completed successfully, and Sarah's latest scan results showed no evidence of remaining cancer. Her hair had started to grow back in soft, dark curls that were different from her original straight hair but somehow felt like a symbol of her transformation. She no longer hid behind high-necked blouses and carefully applied makeup. Instead, she wore her experiences openly, finding strength in her authenticity. "Morning, warrior," Jennifer called out cheerfully as Sarah entered the break room. The nickname had started as a joke, but had become a term of genuine affection among her colleagues. Sarah smiled, still adjusting to being seen as brave rather than unreliable. Jennifer had become one of Sarah's closest allies during her treatment. After learning the truth about Sarah's absences, she had been consumed with guilt about her own judgmental thoughts and had thrown herself into being supportive. She had driven Sarah to appointments when the treatments left her too weak to drive herself, and had even organized a schedule among their colleagues to ensure Sarah always had rides to her medical visits. "How are you feeling today?" Jennifer asked, studying Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to recognize the subtle signs of treatment side effects. "Stronger every day," Sarah replied honestly. It was true in more ways than one. Physically, she was recovering from her treatments and regaining the energy that had been depleted by months of chemotherapy. But emotionally and mentally, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The transformation in her workplace had been remarkable. What had started as a revelation born from desperation had evolved into a culture of openness and support that benefited everyone. Other employees had begun sharing their own struggles, from mental health challenges to family crises, and had found the same kind of understanding that Sarah had received once her truth was known. Mr. Peterson had been true to his word about providing accommodations and support. He had restructured Sarah's responsibilities to allow for flexible scheduling around her medical appointments and had even implemented company-wide policies to better support employees dealing with health issues. The Peterson Marketing Employee Handbook now included comprehensive guidelines about medical leave, flexible scheduling, and creating supportive work environments for people facing health challenges. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation had been in Marcus. The man who had once taken pleasure in Sarah's perceived failures had become her most unexpected champion. His guilt over his treatment of her had initially been overwhelming, but Sarah had helped him channel it into positive action. Marcus had spent hours researching cancer support organizations and had convinced Mr. Peterson to sponsor the office's participation in several fundraising events. He had also become an advocate for workplace empathy, speaking up whenever he heard colleagues making assumptions about each other's behaviors or circumstances. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes?" Marcus asked, approaching her desk as she reviewed client proposals. His tone was respectful and careful, as it had been ever since her revelation. The easy arrogance that had once characterized his interactions with her was completely gone. "Of course," Sarah replied, looking up from her work. Their relationship had evolved into something she never could have imagined during those dark days when his comments had added salt to her already painful wounds. "I wanted to run something by you," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her desk. "I've been working on a proposal for Mr. Peterson about creating a more formal support system for employees going through health crises. I know we've made a lot of improvements, but I think we could do even more." Sarah listened as Marcus outlined his ideas for an employee assistance program that would include not just practical support like transportation to medical appointments and meal delivery during recovery periods, but also emotional support through counseling services and peer support groups. "I want to make sure I'm not overstepping," Marcus said carefully. "Your experience opened my eyes to how much I didn't understand about what people might be going through, and I want to help make sure no one else has to face what you faced alone." Sarah was moved by his sincerity and impressed by the thoughtfulness of his proposal. The man who had once mocked her mysterious personal issues was now working to ensure that other employees with similar challenges would find understanding instead of judgment. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Sarah told him, "and I'd be happy to help you develop it further." As they worked together on refining the proposal, Sarah reflected on how much their dynamic had changed. Marcus was no longer the competitive colleague who saw her success as a threat to his own advancement. Instead, he had become someone who understood that supporting others ultimately made the entire team stronger. The conversation was interrupted by Jennifer, who appeared at Sarah's desk with an excited expression. "Sarah, you need to see this," Jennifer said, holding up her phone. "The campaign you designed for the Bradley Foundation is being featured in Marketing Today as one of the most impactful awareness campaigns of the year." Sarah looked at the article Jennifer was showing her, which highlighted the breast cancer awareness campaign she had created for one of their nonprofit clients. The campaign had been deeply personal for Sarah, informed by her own experience with the disease and her understanding of the fear and isolation that often accompanied a cancer diagnosis. The article specifically mentions how authentic and powerful the messaging is, Jennifer continued reading. "They say it doesn't feel like typical awareness campaign copy because it clearly comes from real understanding and experience." Sarah smiled as she read the article. The campaign had been one of her first major projects after returning to full-time work following her treatment. She had poured her heart into it, using her own journey to inform messaging that would reach other women facing similar diagnoses. The recognition felt especially meaningful because it validated her decision to use her experience as a source of strength rather than shame. Mr. Peterson appeared beside their small group, having overheard the conversation about the article. "Sarah, this is incredible recognition," he said with obvious pride. "This campaign is exactly why I knew we needed to support you through your treatment. Your perspective and experience made this work possible, and it's already helping other women who are going through what you went through." The comment highlighted something important that Sarah had learned over the past months. Her experience with cancer, while painful and frightening, had also given her insights and empathy that made her better at her job, not worse. She could now create campaigns for healthcare clients with an authenticity that came from personal experience. She could understand the emotional needs of people facing health crises in ways that informed more effective messaging and outreach. "I'd like to discuss expanding our work with healthcare and nonprofit clients," Mr. Peterson continued. "Your perspective could be invaluable for organizations serving people in vulnerable situations." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear and shame that had once consumed her had been replaced by a sense of purpose and authenticity that made every day more meaningful. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, terrified of revealing her diagnosis and convinced that her cancer made her weak and unreliable. That woman had been living in a prison of her own making, sacrificing her relationships and her peace of mind to maintain a facade that ultimately benefited no one. The woman she was now understood that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that sharing her truth had not diminished her but had instead connected her more deeply with the people around her. She had learned that most people, when faced with real honesty about human struggle, responded with compassion rather than judgment. As she prepared to leave work that day, Sarah reflected on the phone call she had received that morning from her oncologist. Her latest test results showed that she remained cancer-free, and her doctor had expressed amazement at how well she was recovering both physically and emotionally. "Many of my patients struggle with depression and anxiety for years after treatment," her doctor had said, "but you seem to have found a way to integrate this experience into your life in a positive way." Sarah had thought about that comment throughout the day. She realized that her decision to reveal her truth at work had been a turning point not just in her professional relationships, but in her relationship with her own illness. Instead of seeing her cancer as something to be ashamed of and hidden, she had learned to see it as part of her story that had taught her valuable lessons about courage, authenticity, and human connection. The support she had received from her colleagues after her revelation had been overwhelming. People had shared their own experiences with illness, loss, and struggle, creating bonds that went far deeper than typical workplace relationships. The office had become a community where people felt safe being honest about their challenges, and where support was offered freely and without judgment. Jennifer walked with Sarah to the parking garage, a routine they had established during Sarah's treatment and had continued even after she was feeling better. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Jennifer said as they walked. "About how hiding your diagnosis was actually harder than dealing with the cancer itself." Sarah nodded, remembering their conversation about the emotional toll of secrecy and pretense. "I realize I do the same thing with other parts of my life," Jennifer continued. "I pretend everything is fine when I'm struggling with my anxiety or when I'm having problems at home. I act like I have everything together when really I'm barely holding on sometimes." "It's exhausting, isn't it?" Sarah said with understanding. "Trying to be perfect all the time, hiding anything that might make people think less of you?" "Yes," Jennifer agreed. "But watching how people responded to your honesty made me realize that most of the judgment I'm afraid of is in my own head. People are usually more understanding than we expect them to be." As they reached their cars, Sarah thought about how many similar conversations she had had with colleagues over the past months. Her willingness to be vulnerable had given others permission to be vulnerable as well, creating a ripple effect of authenticity throughout their workplace. Driving home, Sarah passed the hospital where she had received her treatments. The building that had once filled her with dread now looked different to her. It was still a place associated with illness and fear, but it was also a place where she had learned about her own strength and resilience. She thought about all the people inside those walls who were facing their own health crises, many of them probably struggling with the same fears about judgment and discrimination that had once paralyzed her. She wondered how many of them were hiding their diagnoses from employers and colleagues, sacrificing support and understanding to maintain privacy that ultimately isolated them. That evening, Sarah sat down at her computer and began writing. She had been thinking for weeks about sharing her story more broadly, beyond just her immediate workplace. The positive response to her cancer awareness campaign had shown her that her experience could help other people who were facing similar challenges. She wrote about the fear and shame that had driven her to hide her diagnosis, about the way secrecy had amplified her suffering, and about the liberation that had come with telling her truth. She wrote about Marcus's transformation from tormentor to ally, about Jennifer's guilt and growth, and about Mr. Peterson's leadership in creating a more supportive workplace culture. Most importantly, she wrote about the lesson that had changed her life, that the things we're most afraid to reveal about ourselves are often the very things that can connect us most deeply with others and help us find the support we need to heal. As she finished writing, Sarah felt the same sense of liberation she had experienced that day in the break room when she had finally told her colleagues the truth about her absences. She was no longer the woman who hid her struggles behind excuses and facades. She was someone who had learned that authenticity, while sometimes frightening, was ultimately the path to genuine connection and meaningful support. The next morning, Sarah would return to work as herself. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but real and honest about both her struggles and her strength. And in being truly herself, she had discovered that she was more valued and respected than she had ever been when she was trying to be someone else. Her journey from shame to authenticity had not only saved her job and her relationships, but had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be strong. True strength, she had learned, was not about hiding your vulnerabilities, but about facing them with courage and allowing others to support you through them. Sarah looked at her reflection in her computer screen and smiled. The woman looking back at her was scarred, but not broken, changed, but not diminished, vulnerable, but not weak. She was a survivor in every sense of the word, and she was finally proud of who she had become.